A tourist threw hot coffee in the guard's face, thinking he was in charge. But the hero's response made the crowd fall silent, and the consequences turned the entire day upside down. The bustling morning energy of London unfolded as usual at Buckingham Palace. The humid air carried the aroma of coffee from nearby street cafes, mingled with the scent of fresh foliage and the crunch of gravel under the feet of tourists. Guard William stood motionless by the massive gates, like a statue guarding the very heart of British history. William was a 28-year-old man with fair skin, a serious expression, and a bearing that commanded respect. His red uniform and tall bearskin hat gave him an almost mythical appearance, as though he himself were a part of the ancient walls around him. His gaze was fixed forward, slightly unfocused, ensuring he didn't make eye contact with anyone. His hands gripped his rifle tightly, his body as still as marble. The crowd of tourists buzzed around, taking thousands of pictures. Some whispered in awe, while others loudly debated whether paying for a tour inside was worth it. A few intentionally positioned themselves to make it look like the guard was staring straight into their cameras. William heard all of it, but to him, it was just background noise. He had mastered the art of tuning out the chaos around him. However, one voice rose above the chatter and the clicking of cameras. Loud, brash, and overconfident, it sounded less like a person and more like a megaphone. The voice belonged to Jim, a tourist from the United States radiating smugness. Jim, a tall 35-year-old man, wore a bright orange jacket, blue jeans, and a baseball cap emblazoned with the American flag. He walked through the crowd as though he owned it, holding a cup of steaming coffee in one hand and taking large, lazy sips as he smirked at the guard. His confidence was so overbearing that even those trying to ignore him couldn't help but glance his way. "Hey, buddy, give us a smile," he called out, raising his coffee cup as if commanding the world to stop and pay attention. A few tourists chuckled, unsure whether to laugh at the absurdity of the situation or at Jim himself, with his ridiculous king of the tourists demeanor. But for Jim, that wasn't enough. He took a few steps forward, crossing an invisible boundary most tourists instinctively respected. His movements were provocatively slow, as if he were giving everyone time to record his heroic act on video. "What are you, a robot?" he continued, leaning closer to William. The crowd murmured. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. An older woman with a camera muttered under her breath, "This is just disgraceful. How can anyone behave like that?" But Jim seemed deaf to any moral judgment. To him, William wasn't a person, but a living attraction, part of the British show. The thought clearly lingered in Jim's mind. I'm a tourist. I'm paying money, so I'm entitled to entertainment. William, however, stood like a rock. His face remained utterly composed, his gaze unflinching. Internally, tension simmered, but it didn't surface in the slightest movement. This was his duty, to embody discipline and resilience, and he knew he would handle this morning like he had countless others before it. Feeling like the star of the show, Jim turned to the crowd. "Well, someone get this on camera. The guy doesn't even flinch. Guess his batteries are dead." The crowd reacted in mixed ways. Some laughed awkwardly, pretending it was funny. Others quietly fumed. Cameras clicked, capturing every second. "Come on, Britain, entertain us." Jim took another sip of coffee and waved his hand lazily, as if signaling for the show to begin. It felt as though the morning itself had paused, the tension in the air growing almost tangible. William remained motionless, but his gaze, just slightly sharpened, conveyed more than any outward reaction could. He knew this morning was far from over. Jim, with a smug grin plastered across his face, stepped closer to William, and the crowd could feel the air grow heavier. It wasn't just a physical boundary he crossed. It was a line between respect and provocation, between culture and selfish entitlement. "What are you, a robot?" How about a please? Jim sneered, his voice dripping with mockery, as if the entire scene belonged to him. The crowd immediately stirred, like an audience in an arena, anticipating what would happen next. Someone whispered nervously, "Is he serious? He shouldn't be getting that close." But Jim was too absorbed in his impromptu performance to notice. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of pushing limits, like a child discovering how far they could go before crossing the line. He stepped even closer, as if testing how much he could provoke before William would react. The guard, motionless as a sculpture, didn't flinch. His gaze remained straight, sharp, and almost regal. Jim, on the other hand, filled the space with chaotic energy, waving his coffee cup around like it was a scepter that granted him authority over the moment. "Come on, entertain us, man," Jim shouted loudly enough for everyone to hear. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. People exchanged uneasy glances. Some frowned, while others stifled nervous laughter. An elderly couple standing near the front seemed on the verge of stepping in. The woman sighed and muttered, "This is just disrespectful. Hard to even watch." Jim, of course, wasn't listening. To him, the crowd was merely a backdrop, extras in his little production. He pulled out his phone, already opened to the camera app, and began framing his shot. "Hey, everyone, check this out. I'm gonna get a picture where it looks like I'm wearing this guy's funny hat," he announced, waving his phone around to draw even more attention. Slowly, he raised the phone, carefully angling it to capture the perfect perspective. The camera focused on William, whose unflinching stillness had now become the centerpiece of Jim's masterpiece. In Jim's mind, this was the pinnacle of humor. "Look, just like in the movies," he yelled, glancing back at the crowd for approval. The crowd was split. Some chuckled awkwardly, not fully understanding how humiliating this was for the guard. Others glared, their faces filled with disapproval. A young man in a green jacket turned to his friend and muttered, "Why is he doing this? This is the Royal Guard, not a circus." But Jim didn't care. His focus was entirely on getting the perfect shot. Stepping even closer, he tilted the phone to position the bearskin hat squarely on his head. His fingers gripped the phone and his unsteady feet shifted nervously, as if teetering on the edge of his own audacity. "Oh, come on, relax. It's just a joke," he shouted, as if trying to justify himself to those now filming the scene on their own phones. Meanwhile, William remained completely still. His gaze locked straight ahead, never wavered. But he could feel the tension mounting. Not a physical tension, but the kind of pressure that builds when confronted by someone who has no concept of boundaries. Jim took another step closer, leaning in so far it seemed he was trying to catch William's eye. The crowd tensed collectively. A heavy silence settled over the square, broken only by the clicking of cameras. "Well, aren't you even going to say hello? Or is everyone here really this boring?" Jim smirked, hoping for any reaction. But as expected, William didn't move a muscle. He stood as the embodiment of discipline, his expression stoic and impenetrable. The crowd continued to watch as Jim turned back to his phone, fumbling awkwardly to take yet another photo. His movements became clumsier, but he was so engrossed in his mission that he didn't notice the growing resentment in the crowd. Someone finally muttered quietly but firmly, "This isn't funny anymore." The tension in the air coiled tighter, like an invisible spring about to snap. The crowd, which had been lazily watching just moments earlier, was now transfixed. Something about the heavy silence that followed Jim's words hinted that something unexpected was about to happen. And as is often the case, the center of attention was a man completely disconnected from reality. With a wide grin on his face, Jim stared at William as if waiting for the guard to finally break and show some emotion. But William remained as still as ever, his expression unchanging, like an ancient stone impervious to time or weather. For Jim, this stoicism was a challenge. His eyes sparkled with excitement, as though he were a contestant in a game where the grand prize was getting a reaction from the unmoving soldier. "Looks like British pride is as dead as your cooking," Jim called out, his voice echoing across the square. Gasps and murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Some tourists exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of shock and disapproval. A young woman in a navy coat whispered to her companion, "This is just disgusting." Jim, however, seemed oblivious to the judgmental stares. To him, the people around were mere spectators, and he was the star of the show. His confidence radiated through the air, irritating everyone more and more. He took another slow step forward, now standing so close to William that he could see his own smirking reflection in the guard's stoic eyes. "Come on, man, say something. This is supposed to be fun," Jim sneered, his tone equal parts taunting and mocking. The coffee cup in his hand swayed slightly, the hot liquid sloshing with each exaggerated movement as if punctuating his words. Someone from the crowd tried to intervene. A man in his 50s, standing a little off to the side, raised his voice. "Hey, don't do anything stupid, man. Just leave him alone." Jim turned briefly, glancing at the man who had dared to speak up. His expression flashed with disdain. "Stupid? Oh, come on, it's just a bit of fun," he scoffed, waving the comment away before turning back to the guard. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People could sense the invisible line had already been crossed. Some pulled out their phones to record the escalating scene, while others stood frozen, appalled by Jim's audacity. "Look at this. British tradition in action. Doesn't move, doesn't talk. Maybe they really are robots." Jim shouted louder now, as though trying to drown out the growing unease in the crowd. But even that statement seemed to dissolve into the stillness radiating from William. His immobility was so powerful it overshadowed all the chaos surrounding him. Then, with a grin so smug it made people look away in discomfort, Jim did something no one expected. He raised his coffee cup, hesitating for a moment as though considering whether to go that far. Then, with one swift motion, he flung the hot liquid straight into William's face. Shock rippled through the crowd like a wave crashing over them. Several people gasped loudly. Someone screamed. A few instinctively moved forward, as if trying to stop what had already happened, though it was far too late. The coffee splattered across William's face and uniform, leaving dark stains on his perfectly pressed red tunic. The hot liquid trickled down his cheek, but William didn't flinch. His figure remained as steady as a rock, his gaze just as unwavering. It was almost surreal to witness such composure after such a blatant act of disrespect. Jim took a step back, staring at his handiwork. But his self-satisfied grin began to fade as he noticed the crowd's reaction shift. The faint laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by condemnation. "That's too much," someone in the crowd said loudly. "How could he?" another voice murmured, a woman clutching her hands to her chest. The murmurs grew into louder shouts. Some demanded that Jim be stopped, while others stared at him in stunned silence. Jim, trying to salvage his bravado, raised his hands defensively. "Oh, relax, people. It's just a joke," he called out, as if attempting to justify himself. But there was no one left to laugh. The crowd's eyes were now focused on William, who stood unshaken, embodying a level of discipline that seemed almost superhuman. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew something had to happen, but no one could predict what it would be. The crowd froze, as if everyone had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. Hot coffee dripped down William's unmoving face, leaving dark stains on his perfectly pressed red tunic. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a symbolic slap in the face to everything he stood for: tradition, discipline, and honor. And then, for the first time all day, William took a step forward, a single deliberate motion that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. His polished black boots struck the cobblestones with a sharp, resonant sound that echoed across the square, slicing through the crowd's stunned silence. His face, which had been a mask of calm, now bore an expression of unyielding resolve. His gaze was icy, as cold as a winter dawn over the Thames, and his posture seemed to say, "You've made a grave mistake, sir. You've crossed the line, sir," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of a tolling bell. The crowd came alive instantly. It was like a lightning strike had jolted them awake. People began murmuring and gasping, some fumbling to capture the moment on their phones. "That's too far," shouted a young man in a khaki jacket. "He needs to apologize," added a woman in a dark coat, her voice trembling with indignation. Meanwhile, Jim's smug expression began to crumble. The grin that had been plastered on his face faded, replaced by wide-eyed uncertainty. For the first time, he seemed to realize he'd gone too far. He stammered, but his voice was shaky, barely audible. Words wouldn't save him now. The crowd had turned against him, and it showed. Disapproving glares bore into his back, and the occasional shouted remark fanned the flames of his unease. How could he even think of doing that? What a disgrace. That's the Royal Guard. Jim, visibly nervous, stepped back, his hands fidgeting as if trying to conjure an explanation, but no coherent excuse came. At that moment, a group of palace security officers appeared in the distance. Their dark uniforms stood out against the crowd as they confidently made their way toward the scene. Several people in the crowd pointed toward Jim, their gestures filled with anger and indignation. "There he is! That guy right there!" shouted a man, waving his arm toward Jim. Despite the chaos, William remained unmoving. His presence commanded the scene, towering over it with an air of authority and unshakable resolve. He was the embodiment of discipline, a figure unbroken even by such a blatant act of disrespect. The crowd buzzed with emotion. Some faces reflected admiration for William's composure, while others displayed deep contempt for Jim's actions. "This is unbelievable. How can he stand there so calmly after all that?" someone murmured, their words resonating with those nearby, further amplifying the respect for the guard. Jim, now visibly shaken, began babbling in an attempt to defend himself. It was just a joke. You know, I didn't mean anything by it." But there was no laughter left in the crowd. Every stare directed at him seemed to scream, "A joke? Really? That's what you're calling this?" The security officers finally reached the scene, and the tension in the air grew almost unbearable. William remained silent, saying nothing more. Instead, with a single, measured motion, he adjusted his bearskin hat, as if punctuating the entire ordeal with an unspoken final word. Jim, who had felt like the king of the situation just a minute ago, now resembled a cornered mouse. He tried to justify himself, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. No one looked at him with interest or approval anymore. Instead, every gaze was filled with indignation and judgment. "It was a joke. You understand? Just a joke," he muttered, his voice trembling with growing fear. But of course his words sounded pitiful. It was far too late. The crowd was no longer a neutral audience. "A joke? Who jokes like that?" shouted a woman with short hair and a camera in her hands, her face flushed with anger. "That's absolutely disgusting," a man in a green jacket chimed in. "He deserves to be kicked out of here." The condemning shouts grew louder. The crowd had transformed into a jury, ready to deliver its verdict. Jim looked around desperately, searching for even one person who might support him, but of course there was no one. Meanwhile, one of the palace security officers, a fair-skinned man around 40 with a sharp, commanding presence, confidently approached William. His steps were deliberate, and his focused gaze quickly took in the situation before turning to the guard. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm yet professional, with a tone of genuine concern. The crowd instantly hushed, waiting for William's response. Slowly, for the first time, William turned his head to the officer. His face remained stern, but his eyes revealed a quiet triumph. "Yes, sir. Duty continues," he replied steadily, adjusting his bearskin hat. Those simple words seemed to summarize everything that had just happened. The crowd erupted into murmurs. "What composure! He's incredible." The officer nodded, satisfied with the response, and gestured for 2 more colleagues to join him. Together, they turned toward Jim, who finally realized the situation was entirely out of his control. "Wait, I can explain. It was a misunderstanding," Jim began, his voice loud but panicked, bordering on hysteria. One of the security officers calmly but firmly responded, "Sir, leave the premises, immediately." Jim tried to resist, raising his hands as if to say, "Hey, I didn't mean any harm," but the guards moved in unison. One gently but firmly took him by the elbow, while another cleared a path through the gathered tourists. "He deserves it!" someone shouted from the crowd. The shout was quickly echoed by others. The tourists, who had been passive observers earlier, were now active participants in the moment. Some began filming the scene with their phones, cameras clicking and videos rolling. Jim, clearly unprepared for this turn of events, looked utterly defeated. His face, which moments ago had radiated arrogance, now resembled a mask of someone fully grasping the weight of their mistakes. "You don't understand! I didn't mean any harm! It was just a joke!" he yelled, but his words were lost in the noise of the crowd. Meanwhile, some tourists had already begun uploading videos to social media. Within minutes, headlines like, "Tourist humiliates guard, gets what he deserves," or "British guard's composure triumphs over tourists' disrespect," were inevitable. When Jim was finally escorted off palace grounds, the crowd let out an approving cheer. Some even started clapping for William, with a few shouting words of encouragement. "You're amazing! A true professional!" William, unmoved by the applause, simply adjusted his hat once more and returned to his post. His stillness, his absolute restraint, had once again become a symbol of British honor and resilience. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though a few lingered, discussing what they had just witnessed. Cameras continued to click, and respect was etched on many faces. It seemed the day had become a lesson, not just for Jim, but for anyone else considering crossing the line. As the last trace of Jim disappeared behind the line of security guards, the crowd erupted into applause, almost as if releasing a collective sigh of relief. This wasn't just approval. It was an act of respect for the man who had risen above the absurdity of the situation. William, back in his position by the gates, didn't flinch in response. His face returned to its calm, nearly monumental expression, the same one he had worn since morning. But to the crowd, he was no longer just a guard. He was now a symbol of resilience, patience, and discipline, qualities that many could only aspire to embody. In the front row stood a boy of about 10, with light blonde hair and wide blue eyes. He clutched a plastic bottle of water that his parents had just bought from a nearby kiosk. His small hand trembled with nervous excitement, but he gathered his courage. Stepping slightly closer to the line, the boy extended the bottle toward William, his face both serious and full of admiration. William cast a brief glance at the boy, and for a fleeting moment his lips twitched into the faintest, warmest smile. He gave the boy a slight nod of acknowledgement, but didn't take the water. It was one of those rare moments that required no words, a gesture that conveyed more gratitude than a simple "thank you" ever could. "That's true resilience," someone in the crowd said. The voice belonged to a middle-aged man in a tailored coat. His words sounded more like a statement than a comment. "A real professional," added a woman nearby, clapping lightly. The crowd murmured in agreement, exchanging nods and words of admiration. Pride and respect were evident in their tones. Some even tried to compliment William directly, though he remained as composed as ever. Meanwhile, those who had recorded the incident were already uploading their videos to social media. Headlines practically wrote themselves, "Tourist humiliates guard and gets what he deserves." British guard's unshakable resilience leaves crowd in awe. Clips of Jim throwing coffee and William's unwavering composure began to go viral almost instantly. Comments poured in from all over. "This is incredible. What professionalism! That tourist should be ashamed. Absolutely disgraceful behavior." Despite the flurry of online attention, William carried on with his duty as if nothing had happened. Only the faintest glimmer in his eyes hinted that he was aware he had become part of something much larger. One of the security guards, a fair-skinned man with a short haircut and a cheerful demeanor, passed by William and couldn't resist stopping. Smirking slightly, he leaned in and said, "Nice work, mate. Thinking about opening a patient school? I'd be your first student." The crowd chuckled. The guard's comment added a touch of humor to the gravity of the moment, a gentle reminder that even in the most serious situations, a little levity could be found. William, of course, didn't respond. He simply adjusted his bearskin hat slightly and resumed his focus on his duty, as immovable and steadfast as ever. British resilience had triumphed once again, and as the crowd began to disperse, they left the square with more than just photos and memories. They carried with them a lesson, a reminder that respect, patience, and honor are virtues that never go out of style.